Harris students do in a section on race. But I've been hearing about Jack Johnson and thinking about Jack Johnson for probably 20 years or so, because one of my dissertation advisors, a guy named Randy Roberts, wrote the definitive biography on Jack Johnson way back in like the early 1980s, when it wasn't yet cool in the academy to write about sports and to write about these sorts of things. He was sort of a pioneer in the field. And I'm going to be using some clips today from PBS, and a particularly good PBS documentary called Unforgivable Blackness, which is about Jack Johnson's life and career. It's free. You can easily find it on the PBS webpage. You can check it out on your iPads or your laptops. And if you watch that, one of the talking heads is my old mentor, Randy Roberts. He shows up a number of times in that talking. But I think there are some interesting crossovers between Johnson's life and Anzia Yezierski's life and Theodore Roosevelt's life that maybe we'll tease out at the end of talk today. But I thought first and foremost, maybe we would actually start with a video clip, just an introduction to Johnson. And this is actually from that documentary.
On the morning of July 4th, 1910, 15 special trains pulled into the little desert town of Reno, Nevada. Aboard were thousands of white men who had paid their way across the country to see a prize fight unlike any that had ever taken place before. They had come to see their hero, the white ex-heavyweight champion Jim Jeffries, take back the title from the first African-American ever to hold it, Jack Johnson. It was, said the Chicago Tribune, going to be a contest between the white man's hope and the black peril. Somehow, in the minds of many white Americans, this boxing match would decide whose country America really was. Who was meant to be in charge. For more than 13 years, Jack Johnson was the most famous and the most notorious African American on earth. He battled his way from obscurity to the top of the heavyweight ranks, won the greatest prize in American sports, a prize that had always been the private preserve of white combatants, then suffered persecution at the hands of his own government, and years of exile before the title was taken from him. And he did all these things during the years which marked the low point of African American life after emancipation. Abandoned by the federal government, denied the vote if they lived below the Mason-Dixon line, and living under the constant threat of mob violence, black Americans at the turn of the 20th century were no longer enslaved, but not yet truly free. Jack Johnson insisted on being free. When whites ran everything, Jack Johnson took orders from no one. While most African Americans struggled merely to survive, Jack Johnson reveled in his riches and his fame. When black Americans were expected to defer to whites, Jack Johnson battered them to the ground. And at a time when the mere suspicion that a black man had flirted with a white woman could cost him his life, Jack Johnson slept with whomever he pleased. To most whites, and to some African Americans, Johnson was a perpetual threat, profligate, arrogant, amoral, a dark menace, and a danger to the natural order of things. The real Jack Johnson was both more and less than those who loved or those who hated him ever knew. Just remember, he told a young reporter not long before he died, whatever you write about me, that I was a man.
Okay. There we go. There's a nice, brief kind of introduction to some of the context here. Johnson, clearly a fairly divisive figure in American society at the turn of the 20th century. So just based on impressions on that little introduction there, what's problematic to many Americans about Jack Johnson? Why is he so threatening, do you think, based on kind of what they gave you? His race first and foremost, right? The fact that he's a black man in boxing. And boxing at the time is considered to be like the epitome of sports. It was considered to be the best athletic test in the world, right? You had to be smart, you had to be physically strong. It wasn't enough to just be a brute who hit people hard. There was a scientific side to it. So it was considered that people, why they accepted that a black athlete might be a good boxer in the sense that they were strong and physical, but the presumption was that a black man would never be able to beat a white man because of the scientific side to the sport. Yes, sir? There's a very close narrative here between the idea of why NFL owners and coaches are saying black people aren't playing quarterback in the NFL later. The idea is like, yeah, physically they fit these positions, but there's a mental side to quarterback that separates them. And owners. Yeah, very much. Yeah, it's a narrative that doesn't go away, right? Which I think is part of the lesson of Jack Johnson's story at the turn of the 20th century. So, a question I ask my students a lot of times, right? If we could practice a sense of like empathy for a second, if we could put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, what would be so exciting about Jack Johnson, particularly to a black audience at the turn of the 20th century? His power. Oh, what a great word, power, right? The power to do what? And yeah, that's very clear. Yes, ma'am.
Breaking the cultural rules.
Yeah, breaking the rules that have been established to paint black Americans into a very particular segregated corner in American society. Johnson very clearly does what he wants, right? He loves fast cars, he loves women. He'll be married to 3 separate women over the course of his life, all of whom were white. So he has the power to do things that a lot of people like him simply could not do at the turn of the 20th century. So I think power is a particularly adept word to apply here. Yes, sir?
Do you think the black community also looked at it and said, he's not one of us, he wants to be white?
I think that there absolutely were people in the black community who were upset with Johnson. And there absolutely were people who said he's above himself. He's getting above his raising, essentially, right? Like he isn't being who we want him to be. So he's a divisive figure in the black community. He's a divisive figure in the white community as well, right? The thing that made him exciting for a lot of particularly younger black Americans at the time. So I would say, people who were sort of teenage up to like the early 30s at the turn of the 20th century was that Johnson represented somebody who was really sort of disappearing in American society and culture. There were a number of successful black athletes in the late 19th century who were sort of fading from public view. Fleetwood Walker, Moses Fleetwood Walker would be one. Fleetwood Walker was the first man of color to play professional baseball. He's playing in Ohio in the 1880s, and eventually his career ends because leagues begin instituting white-only clauses. So a dozen or so black men who were playing professional baseball at that time just sort of lose the opportunity and then get sort of obscured, and people forget that they had done that until Jackie Robinson comes around, right? there were another place you often saw black men in professional sports was in the jockeying world, right, in the horse racing world. That was a very common place. There were a number of celebrated black jockeys in the late 19th century. But by the time we get to really by the time we get to the 1920s, for sure, the narrative around that professional sport has become, look, the jockeys who are black are great, but the reason they're winning isn't because of them, it's because of the white trainers who are raising these horses, and really they're the ones that should be, credited with the victories. The people who are doing the riding are just sort of riding, right? Which isn't the truth if you've ever had any kind of exposure to that world. My larger point here is that people like Jack Johnson weren't necessarily an anomaly, black men competing against white men in professional sports for entertainment. It wasn't a new thing, which often shocks people, right? They were disappearing. And one of the reasons why they were disappearing was because leisure and spending money simply to have fun, like going to movies, going to theaters, not for edification, but just enjoy it, and going to sporting events were becoming more acceptable for middle-class Americans in the 1890s and the early 20th century. So part of making sports acceptable for middle-class audiences was whitewashing it, right? Making sure that the product one paid to see was as civilized as possible, and that meant excluding black participants. So Johnson, for a lot of people like him, his career was this sort of insistence that we're not all of us are going away. We're not going to go anywhere, and you can't necessarily always make us toe these racially segregated lines. Johnson is part of a larger generation of African Americans who were born post-emancipation. Right? He's born in Galveston, Texas, in 1878. And he had a lot in common with people like him in that part of the country during those years. Both of his parents worked. His mom was a laundress. His dad worked in food. He did some kind of baking for a while. He did other small businesses. So they are members of a nascent black middle class, right? Johnson, as a boy, got some education, but also was working to help support the family by the time he was 9 or 10 years old, which again wasn't unusual for somebody who was black at that time period. And really, it's going to be quite normal for black children to help contribute to the family income really up until about the 1940s or so. So Johnson kicked around for a little bit. He was a porter in a gambling house. He did some janitorial work. He was a baker's assistant for a little bit. But he was somebody who very much grew up in a home where his parents expected him to be able to succeed in ways they had not been able to succeed because of having been born this first generation who on paper are given economic and civic rights that had been denied to their parents. So for Johnson, it's a really big thing here that he is going to be in charge of deciding how he is going to succeed in life. Right? That's a brand new thing for black people of the late 19th century. Now, at the same time, Johnson's chosen profession as a boxer and the way he lived his life was out of step with the larger uplift movement in the black civil rights movement at the turn of the 20th century. People like Ida B. Wells, T. Thomas Fortune, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, very much preached this mentality that black Americans needed to demonstrate they were capable of acting like white Americans, accruing the same type of education, demonstrating the same type of Protestant morality, having homes that very much looked like white middle class homes. And that is for a very good reason. First and foremost, because they are building their own support networks to educate their own children and create opportunities for their own children, but also because they are fighting the growing power of scientific racism based on social Darwinism in the late 19th century. Increasingly, as we get closer to 1900, this belief becomes more entrenched that black people are inherently different than white people and thus deserve to be segregated for everybody's best interests. That's a relatively new idea, the idea that difference is scientifically grounded in biology. So civil rights workers of the turn of the 20th century are hard at work disproving that. That's why there's so much emphasis on uplift, on pulling people up as you go, on getting college educations, on becoming ministers, on opening businesses that are an asset to the community. It's like saying, look, we can fit in, right? We aren't that different. We are capable of success. So to the larger civil rights movement, Johnson's a problem, right? Because Johnson spends his money on women, he spends his money on gaudy clothes, he spends his money on cars. He wasn't that interested in civil rights. He wasn't that interested in like helping bring other people along. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. He wanted the power to be Jack Johnson in the way he wanted to be Jack Johnson. So Johnson, who again grows up in Galveston, Texas, is very clearly by his teenage years trying to make decisions that demonstrate he knows what other people think of him and that he wants to do things his own way. Not necessarily the way his parents wanted him to do it, not necessarily the way larger society expected him to do it. Johnson ran with a racially mixed gang as a boy while he was working around town. That network of people put him in touch with contacts in Dallas, Texas, where he's left. By the time he's 16, he's gone to Dallas because there is a small boxing circuit in Texas, and Dallas is sort of the epicenter of it. So he makes the decision to go to Dallas because if he wants to box, that's where he needs to go. So he's in Dallas by 1894, and he's there for a couple of years. He's there for a relatively short period of time. He comes back to Galveston and is working manual labor jobs and fighting in Galveston. But he's not happy with the boxing matches he's getting. Again, the boxing matches that he could get as a teenager in Galveston weren't, officially refereed, sanctioned fights. They're really brawls. I don't know how many of y'all, I'm going to expose my hillbilly background here a little bit, my West Arkansas upbringing. But I don't know how many of y'all remember tough man contests from the 70s and 80s. Yeah, so that's essentially what he has afforded to him. It's, you just show up on Saturday night, people pay admission to come in, and there are very few rules about how you fight. It's just sort of last man standing. Bare-knuckled. Not a whole lot of rules against gouging, not a whole lot of rules against kidney punches and rabbit punches, not a whole lot of rules. So it's not this scientific fighting, but that's what was available to somebody like him at the time. He gets his first real fight, for which he's paid $1.50 in 1895, and that's a sanctioned in-the-ring type of fight. He realizes that South Texas isn't going to be the place where he can advance his career, so by 1899, he has moved to Chicago. Again, that kind of seems random, like he went to Chicago, but you have to keep in mind, by the time 1899 rolls around, people who were born just after emancipation are entering their 20s. Plessy versus Ferguson has been handed down, so that's 1896. So segregated society has been upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States. Anybody with an iota of common sense who's black and in the South can read the writing on the wall. And they look around and they say, if I want any chance at doing what I want to do, I'm going to have to leave here. I've got to get out of South. So the very beginning of what becomes known as the Great Migration, which will last from 1896 all the way up through the Second World War, it'll be 1960 before there are more black Americans in the North than in the South. But that trend begins in the 1890s, and Johnson participates in that. So he goes to Chicago specifically because he wants to find a white manager, because he wants a white manager who can find him fights against white boxers. He wants the respect that comes with a boxing career. He wants the best opportunities. So he's not a thug, right? He's not somebody who's happy just to beat up on other people. He wants the best opportunities for himself. He ends up getting a manager whose name is Johnny Connor. Connor was an ex-bantamweight champion, so he had good connections. He was a saloon owner in Chicago, so he hosted fights. It was the best opportunity probably that Johnson had available to him. But what mostly what he's doing early on is just what they called battle royales, which they would typically take a dozen black men, blindfold them, and put them in a ring or put them in an enclosed space and just say whoever's left standing kind of wins at the end of the day. So he doesn't like this, he doesn't want to do it, but he has to play ball with this manager to demonstrate that he's willing to play by certain rules so that he gets better opportunities. It's very little money. It's violent entertainment for white audiences. But that does get him the attention of a couple of promoters who get him a better fight in Chicago. And that leads to a match against a white man named Jim Scanlon in Chicago in 1899. Scanlon was Australian, which probably helps explain why he was willing to fight Johnson when other American white fighters weren't willing to do that. And again, most white fighters didn't want to fight black fighters because they didn't want to be perceived as somebody who would fight below them, right? They realized that they broke that line. There was a punishment for them as well. But he beats Scanlon in a number of rounds and takes that victory away for him. And by January of 1901, he has moved to Memphis for a short period of time, where he gets a $1,000 purse to fight against a black boxer, whose name we don't know, or at least I haven't been able to find in the last couple of years. But he's gone back to Memphis because this is a huge payout for him. A $1,000 purse is a really big purse. He wins that, and he tries to parlay it into a rematch with Scanlon. Scanlon is very happy to fight him again to sort of redeem his reputation. But local judges in Memphis outlawed the fight. They said, there's no way we're letting a black man and a white man, we don't care if he's Australian, we're not letting these people fight in Memphis. So to this point in time, like really what Johnson's doing is looking for bigger purses, looking for acceptance among the promoters and managers who will give him the best opportunities at living a good life. And really what Johnson has become is this kind of figure that we don't really have anymore in American culture. It's a sort of subculture of the sport. Anybody remember that noun, the sport? You ever hear somebody referred to as a real sport? Yeah, so could you describe a sport to me? Like if somebody was a sport, like what kind of person were they?
They played fairly.
They played fairly, right? But it's playing, right?
They are willing to lose with dignity.
They're willing to lose with dignity. But what other attributes would a sport have? Somebody who is sporty.
Dress.
What's that?
Dress.
Dress. How so?
Flash.
They're a flashy dresser, right? The best suits, the best hats. Anything else?
Obnoxiously affable.
Obnoxiously affable. I like that one. I might use that one. Hopefully we'll not be charged with obnoxious affability at some point in my life. Yeah, like the sports, he's one of these guys who's always out there having fun, knows somebody in every street corner, every bar. Yeah, that's real.
In my family, when we used that term, it was somebody who was willing to try something out.
Right. They're a sport in that they're willing to take risks. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So this sort of the sport was a sort of dashing figure who was very involved with gambling, with high living. They were the opposite of good Victorian middle class values. Right. They were sort of outcasts. And what's interesting about the sporting culture, the sporting society, is actually how diverse it was. Because there were people who had a lot of money, right, who were wealthy Ivy League types who considered themselves sports and were into fast living. There were working class Germans and Irish who were in this culture because of their boxing prowess and backgrounds. And there were black men in this. So the sporting culture is one of the very few places in American society where race mattered, but it didn't always matter as much as your sporting qualities. right? That if you gambled, if you were somebody who could be gambled on, you could get sort of, there was like a rough democracy about it. So Johnson is very much drawn to this sporting life, right? Probably, he's, as a kid, he kind of lived that way in Chicago. He probably got his first real exposure to all the possibilities, to the women, to the gambling, to the money. These were things that he very happily imbibed in. So when he's making this decision to go to Memphis for the big money, he's expressing a sports value. He's saying, this is where the money is, that's where I'm going. And then he leaves Memphis because this decision to bar black and white boxing matches will keep him from being a sport. It'll keep him from making the money he needs to do the things you have to do to fit in with the other guys. So right after this decision is handed down, Johnson takes off for California. In California, there is an extensive boxing circuit. It's a bit more liberal. It's a bit easier to get the kinds of fights you want to get in California. And it is very clear that Johnson wants to be a big name. He's an up-and-coming heavyweight on the California circuit. He will win 27 fights over the next couple of years. He develops a particular style that is based on his very long reach. He's massively long arms that allows him to keep a distance from the people he's fighting, allows him to slip them quite easily. That's used against him early in his career, right? White fighters saying, well, I'm not fighting him because either he's a coward or he's yellow, or he's tricky. He won't just stand there and fight. He's very good at this sort of, cat and mouse game. He also develops a reputation for wanting to really punish the people that he fights against. And in particular, when he got fights against white fighters in California, he was extra hard on them. So he fought both black men and white men in those 27 victories. And the black men he would win, but he would almost always end the fight within 3 or 4 rounds. If he fought somebody who was white, it was going 10 or 15 rounds. Because he wanted to make sure everybody knew what he was out to do. That he was that good, he could at will do what he wanted with the guy that he was fighting. The person he has his eye set on is Jim Jeffries. Jeffries says, like every other white boxer of the day, there's no way I'm fighting a black man. And what eventually happens is that Johnson gets a fight against Jack Jeffries in 1904, who was Jim Jeffries' brother. So he takes this fight because he knows Jeffries will come to the fight. And he takes on Jack and he carries him on May 16th, 1904 for 5 rounds. And the entire time he's fighting, he's basically pulling the old, Three Stooges trick where he puts his mitt on top of Jeffries' head and kind of keeps him at a distance and lets him swing, but just sort of teases him. And the entire time he's fighting Jack Jeffries, he's got his hand on him and he's patting him and he's looking into the audience at Jim Jeffries and saying, you're next. I want you. I'm going to beat your brother. Here's what I'm going to do to your brother. And I want you next. After 5 rounds, he knocks Jeffries out and then literally picks him up and carries him back to his corner and sets him down and makes eye contact with Jim Jeffries and says, I want you next. If you're a man, you'll fight me. Jeffries would continue to evade and turn down the opportunity to fight. And eventually he retires and goes to live on an alfalfa farm that he buys with his proceedings. So Johnson does eventually become the heavyweight champion because the belt ends up in the hands of a guy named Tommy Burns, who he will defeat in 1908. When this happens, it sends absolute shockwaves through the American sporting world. Nobody thought this was possible. Again, the newspaper narrative on Johnson was that he's not scientific enough, he'll never really be able to withstand a real fight, a real tactician, a great fighter. These other white fighters he's beat are bums. They're not quite the same caliber. So when he takes out Tommy Burns, it truly shocked a number of boxing experts of the day. He would continue to beat every challenger, every white challenger that came his way for the next year or two, until it was readily apparent that there simply was nobody in the United States that could defeat him. And at that point, people begin imploring Jim Jeffries to step in. Right? They begin saying, "Jeff, you're the great white hope." This is where this phrase comes from. It's time for you to come out of retirement and to teach this guy a lesson. Take back this title, demonstrate that the best white fighter of the last decade is superior to this man. And so one of the things that, again, they said in that clip is the fight was understood as something that would upset the natural order. It was understood as a challenge to white supremacy, and one that Jeffries absolutely had to win. Christian scientist Reverend E. Ransom said, right, the greatest marathon race of the ages is about to begin between the white race and the darkest races. What Johnson seeks to do to Jeffries will be the ambition of Negroes in every domain of human endeavor. So this is, to Americans, more than a boxing match, right? This isn't just a fight, right? This is about school integration. This is about black doctors in white hospitals. This is about every other aspect of American life. If a black man can beat Jim Jeffries, then it's a sign that there's something's true that we all know to be true, which is the logic of segregation is fallible, that it really is based on lies. It's based on a fake science. Right? It simply will not hold water. Jeffries himself assures white Americans, telling them that, look, if you're looking to me to defend athletic supremacy, I'm ready to go, right? I'm ready to defend. It will not take me very long to get back into shape, and I'm going to be honest, he was not in shape. That alfalfa farm, I know we romanticize the honest labor, but Jeffries spent a lot of time drinking beer on that farm. He had gotten quite soft since his retirement. Yeah, I'm ready. To say he was going to win. Maybe he was hedging his bets a little bit. Like, I'm willing to step up and play the part. Yeah, and Jeffries gets guaranteed like a $50,000 guarantee just for stepping in the ring. So he's going to get a big chunk of change just for fighting. And if I remember correctly, I think it was like another 75 to win. So he has a lot of incentives to give it a shot. Right, he has a lot of reasons for getting into this, and I do have a short clip of the fight, just so you can kind of see what it looked like. The first big problem they had in the staging the contest was finding somewhere to hold it, which is how they end up in Reno on July 4th, which just seems like an ungodly hot place to have an outdoor boxing match with 20,000 spectators, but they do it. And they also couldn't find anybody to actually referee the fight. The first invite went to President Taft. And he said, "No, thank you. I want no part of this." Rudyard Kipling, the British author, was the second invite. He was a mammoth boxing fan and wrote extensively about boxing. And he said, "No, I don't want any part of this either." And so eventually what happened was the fight promoter ended up refereeing the match. She'd never refereed a boxing match before, but he went ahead and stood in to do that work. So I have a quick clip here, and again, this is from a YouTube clip, and it's got a little bit of commentary along with it, just to give you a little bit of context. We'll watch a minute or two.
Regardless of division. But the man who gets the finest ovation is bare-knuckle champion Jake Kilrain. Fans will never forget Jake's 75-round fight with champion John L. Sullivan. At exactly 3 minutes to 1, a hush settles over the stadium as champion Jack Johnson makes his way through the crowd. Jack always insists on being the first to enter the ring. He takes this superstition so seriously that it's actually part of the conditions of the contract.
It's a
From the
power
moment
play,
Johnson
right?
enters the ring, the
He
big
wants to be
golden
waiting for the guy
smile,
to
which
come
is his
out.
trademark, never leaves his face. A grimly determined Jeffries enters the ring 4 minutes later. 16,520 excited fight fans are on the edge of their seats as round one gets underway. The fight is scheduled for 45 3-minute rounds, and the temperature is 110 degrees of suffocating heat. Champion Johnson is in brilliant physical condition, weighing 212 pounds. Jeffries, at 226 pounds, is fighting at the same weight at which he last defended the heavyweight championship in 1904 against Jack Monroe. It was a tremendous task for Jeff to get himself into the rock-hard conditioned fighter he is today. Jeffries won the heavyweight championship of the world 11 years ago, on June 9th, 1899, when he knocked out Bob Fitzsimmons in 11 rounds. After successfully defending the crown 7 times in that period between 1899 and 1904, he retired undefeated, having beaten every prominent heavyweight who wanted a chance at his crown. Round one draws to a close with both men conserving their energies, knowing there are a possible 44 rounds. As round four begins, neither fighter has gained a clear advantage. Johnson is getting a $60,000 guarantee for this title defense, by far the biggest ever made to date. Jeffries' guarantee is $40,000, plus the astronomical figure of $75,000 for signing with Rickard for the fight. 1,500 Never Say Die fans crashed over the fence when there simply were no more seats to be sold. In Rickard's financial breakdown of the fight, these same 1,500 crashers were listed as complimentaries. In the previous round, Johnson relentlessly pursued Jeffries all over the ring. Here in round 15, he rushes Jeff against the ropes and lands a hard right uppercut. He follows it up with 3 left hooks, and Jeffries goes down for the first time in his entire professional career. The crowd leaps to its feet at the shock of what's happened. Jeff rises and gets hit with a smashing left hook, which sends him out of the ring. Jeff's chief second, with the help of a fan, lifts him to his feet. Johnson rushes Jeffries across the ring, where he floors Jeff with a paralyzing right to the head. Rickard steps between the two fighters as Sam Berger, in dark vest and hat, rushes in and stops the fight to save Jeffries from further punishment. This startling conclusion puts an end to the most dramatic heavyweight championship fight in the last 75 years.
Okay, there you go. So there's kind of the gist of this fight. What stood out about this event to you? What did you hear that was interesting?
It wasn't refereed very well.
No, it is not refereed very well at all. Right? Yes. Yeah. Johnson was getting paid more money to be in the fight.
Did he get the $75,000 first for winning?
He did. I'm going to correct myself. He got the $75,000 just for showing up, for signing the contract. So yeah, he gets more money off the top just for showing up. What about the number of rounds?
50.
Yeah. No. Yeah, three-minute rounds. And this was considered to be quite safe and progressive, considering where boxing had been in the 19th century. At the opening of the clip, you heard this discussion of Jack Kilrain had beat John L. Sullivan in like 75 rounds. Kilrain was one of like the great 19th century champions. Sullivan, the Boston Strong Boy, was one of the more infamous fighters of the 1880s. And so boxing before the 20th century, there were no time limits on rounds. They literally went until one person fell. And there were as many rounds as the 2 men would toe the scratch for. So sometimes fights went into the hundreds of rounds. You know, I mean, a round might last 30 seconds. It might last 15 minutes. But bare knuckle prize fighting, where there's not a whole lot of head work because you're not wearing gloves, there's a lot of body work. In a lot of these saloons and small venues, that, you know, there was a lot of incentive when the people in your corner are the people who are betting on you to keep getting up and going back into the fight, right? So even though it's insanely hot and there are people crashing this gate and there's a referee who's in no way, shape, or form qualified to do this, this is still considered to be a fairly good fight, even though it's scheduled for 45 rounds. Just today is just inhumane, right? That's nobody in their right mind would agree to doing anything close to that. So the actual film here exists because fight films were quite significant forms of entertainment at the turn of the 20th century. You almost always have it filmed, and then you charge people admission to come watch the film in your local theaters. This particular fight film was edited. Nobody who saw this fight in a theater actually saw Jeffries get knocked out the final time. They edited it and they cut that part out because they were worried at starting riots in movie theaters if you actually saw a black man finishing this fight off. And again, the response is sort of mixed as to what you could say. The black poet William Warren Cuney writes a poem celebrating this victory called, My Lord, What a Morning, right? Yeah, it really is. It really is. There's what is so amazing about that?
Well, that he would admit, he's a white
Yeah.
poet admitting,
Oh no, this is a black poet.
oh, he's a black poet, I'm sorry.
But I still think that there's something important in saying,
Then he had a lot of nerve.
yes. Yes, he did. Yeah, he had a lot of nerve being so blatantly celebrating a black victory in punishing this white fighter. Yes, my lord, fighting is wrong. So there's admission to morals. We know fighting isn't right, but keep him, Lord, as you made him big and strong and black. So again, we tend to think of the concept of like black power and the Black is Beautiful movement as being a very 1960s, very 1970s cultural movement. But here we have it beginning in 1912, a full 8 years before the Harlem Renaissance made it chic in some circles in New York City. Martha, was that a comment?
I don't know if it's important, but he doesn't mention the mental health.
Yeah.
He always says big and strong.
Yeah, you're right, he doesn't. And I think it's very much one based in that concept of pride, that concept of we have something to celebrate and it's a black victory over somebody who's white. But we're going to be we're loud about this. We're not going to hide our feelings. So again, there's this sense that like there is a new generation of black Americans coming of age in the late progressive era who aren't willing to kowtow and to play a certain role anymore, to be deferential. This is not a deferential statement, right? The Chicago Defender, which was a black newspaper, one of the 2 or 3 most important black newspapers in the country at the time, said boldly that he was the first Negro to be admitted the best man in the world, which was what people understood the heavyweight champion to be. Again, the best man. He is the supreme man on the face of the planet. Our champ enjoyed himself quite much, a lot. I've got another short clip for you here to talk a little bit about this guy and what he does with his victory. But just to put a nice little period on the end of some ideas, the fight doesn't really resolve a whole lot in terms of race relations. There were race riots in 25 different states following the fight, 50 different cities. At least 20 people were killed across the United States in these riots. Hundreds more were injured. And this happened from Texas to Colorado to New York to Washington, D.C. Black Americans were jubilant and white Americans sort of struck back, trying to suppress that jubilance. Many cities actually banned the showing of the film, and Teddy Roosevelt, who is a boxer himself and a lover of the sport, actually called for fight films criminalization. He said, this is something that's dragging down our morals. No good can come of this sort of thing. Okay, so one last clip for you here.
Johnson roared around town as if there were no speed limits. He turned over once, demolishing his car, walked away unscathed, and had bought himself a brand new one by noon the next day. He would be fined for speeding scores of times over the years. Sometimes because he really was going too fast. Sometimes simply because white policemen couldn't stand to see a black man behind the wheel of a costly racing car.
There's the story once that Jack Johnson was driving, as he always did, too fast through Georgia, through some dusty red clay section of Jim Crow South, and he was stopped by a policeman, and the policeman said, "Where are you going so fast, boy? That's going to cost you." Jack Johnson said, "How much?" And he said, $50. And Jack Johnson pulled out a roll. I mean, a heavyweight championship, a roll to fit the hand of a heavyweight champion, and peeled off a $100 bill and gave it to the trooper and said, "There." And the trooper said, "I can't change 100. And Johnson said, "Keep the change. I'm coming back the same way I went through."
Johnson also joined a touring vaudeville troupe, following a tradition among champions started by John L. Sullivan. He danced, joked, shadowboxed, and sometimes played the bass. The money was good, $1,300 a week. 1.5 times what the average working man made in a year. But working conditions were tough. He was barred from the heated dressing rooms used by white performers, sometimes forced to dress in the cellar. Theater managers tried to shortchange him. He threatened to kill one if he didn't come up with the $2,500 he claimed to be owed. The man paid up. Later, he got in trouble in New York City for having beaten up a smaller man in a drunken argument. When he was served with a summons, he threw it on the floor. Friends began to worry more and more about what might happen if stories of his erratic behavior and relationships with white women continued to spread. Johnson simply ignored them.
If and suppose. 2 small words, but nobody has ever been able to explain them. One man falls out of bed and is killed. Another falls from a 50-foot scaffold and lives. One man gets shot in the leg and is killed. Another gets a bullet in the brain and lives. I always take a chance on my pleasures. Jack Johnson.
Oh my. So Jack Johnson is very, very clearly unrepentant about his stuff. Yes, sir. Mr. Rowley.
How did he avoid being lynched?
He didn't spend a whole lot of time in the South after he got out. Okay? He stayed in Chicago. He owned a large house, actually moved his family to Chicago.
Stayed out of Indiana.
Yeah, as much as possible, especially southern Indiana. Yeah. He spent time in Chicago. He spent time in New York. He traveled with this vaudeville. And, it helped a lot that he was a commodity. He was somebody who made a lot of other people a lot of money. He was going to get his, but there's a reason why he's problematic and still gets the boxing matches, still gets the vaudeville jobs, still gets all of these opportunities, right? What else was shocking or interesting about this guy and his behavior and how he seemed to approach life? Anything else stick out? Not a lot of fear. Well, he defines life in the fast lane, right? He's got that anecdote about, hey, look, one guy falls from a 50-foot scaffold and walks away from it. Another guy trips and dies. And I find that so interesting because I think it's a remarkable insight into his mentality is, hey, look, I grew up in a world where anything could happen. Nothing's predictable. And if that's the case, then why not do? Why not do what I'm going to do? So, maybe I'll get lynched for this. I mean, well, guess what? I could be a law-abiding citizen who does everything right, makes one wrong turn, and I still get lynched. So why not date white women and race fast cars and drink and have a really good time? Why not flout convention? Because it's going to happen no matter what.
Which almost gives him license, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To be who he is.
Exactly. Yeah, it gives him a license to be who he is. Again, despite the facts I said earlier, that there are people in the black community who are very unhappy with him, because they looked at him and said, look, you're living up to the worst expectations of black men, and also you're living up to the worst expectations of white men as well. Like, you're not emulating the right people. You're hurting our cause. You're making it very difficult for us to make an argument that we can fit in middle-class white society by you knowing what the rules are and flouting them and like bragging about it. Like that's their problem with him in a lot of ways. So Johnson, eventually in 1912 is arrested under a federal law called the Mann Act. Anybody know what the Mann Act was supposed to forbid? Right, yeah. It's supposed to get rid of prostitution by making it illegal to transport women across state lines for, as the law said, illicit purposes. Yeah, essentially. You and Chuck Berry, right? Yeah, they get Chuck Berry for the same thing. Yeah, I mean, it's a federal law that is supposed to prevent innocent farm girls from being kidnapped and taken to Chicago or Detroit or New York for essentially what we now would call human trafficking. Yeah, and this is a whole other conversation, but the law is based on all sorts of misunderstandings about the causes of prostitution, its association. The law gets written, there's this firm belief in the United States that prostitution only exists in the United States because of urbanization, and that it is a relatively new problem that's maybe only existed since the 1870s, which is simply not the truth, right? But again, it's part of it's tied into larger fears about race, ethnicity, urbanization, and how the United States is changing at the turn of the 20th century. And so Johnson, with his desire to marry white women, he dates a number of them. And again, that's part of the sporting culture, is he was with a lot of prostitutes. That's part of that community. He dates a number of them, but it's something people don't like, but they sort of, I don't want to say they ignore it, but they also say, well, these women that he's with, these are not good women. Like, these are city girls. These are ethnic types, right? They're not good girls. They're not good women. Yeah, these are working girls. Until he comes across Lucille Cameron, who is from an upper-class New York City society. He meets her at Saratoga Springs at the horse races one summer, and she leaves her husband to marry him and travel with him. So that this, upper-class white woman would be drawn to Johnson was what really triggered the Mann Act and his problems. And so even though they get married, he is arrested eventually under violation of this federal clause. The first arrest, he gets off of the charge entirely because Cameron refused to cooperate with the court. And her mother is saying she's doing this because she is insane. She has lost her mind. Like, literally has lost her mind. And that's the only reason we can explain why she would do something like this. And Cameron demonstrates that she's not insane. And a judge dismisses the case. He's arrested a second time for the exact same charge later that year. And so Johnson and Cameron skip bail and end up living in France for a couple of years. He eventually returns home. He does a short stint in jail, but then gets out of it. And then he spends the next couple of years fighting on occasion to defend his belt. He ironically refused to fight black fighters between 1912 and 1915. He would only take on white challengers to his title. Again, kind of protecting his own value as a fighter in the same way that those white fighters had done to him back in the 1890s and early 1900s. And he wouldn't lose his title until 1915. He lost it to a cowboy from Kansas named Jess Willard. Willard took him out. Johnson, didn't like losing, mostly because he was making so much money from various endorsements, and that championship belt just kept free money coming in for him. Johnson would live until 1946. Actually, died in Raleigh in 1946. Late in life, he was a known figure for the rest of his life. He was a celebrity of sorts. But I tend to think what's very interesting about his story is that, it would be easy to look at Black Americans in this time period and see them as victims, see them as people without power, to see them as people who struggled until decades in the future when they were given an opportunity by benevolent white authorities to demonstrate their value. And Johnson wasn't a victim. He was a lot of things, but he was not powerless. He was not a victim. He did what he wanted to do. He knew he calculated the costs and benefits of these decisions and made the most out of the opportunities he got. Those opportunities were shaped by his race and by the sporting society at the time, but they were the sorts of things that gave him the sort of chance to do what he wanted in life, even if it upset, other Black leaders. And I think this is what is interesting. If you think about the Roosevelt talk, if you think about Anzia Yezierska, right? You think back, Yezierska is a woman who's an immigrant, who better represented, as we said, this sort of symphony of society rather than the melting pot. The idea that an immigrant could remain an immigrant rather than melting in. And Yezierski, she acted like she was an immigrant, even though she assimilated, because she knew that's where the money was in writing, right? Roosevelt redefined what people expected of presidents, of people his class, right? He was willing to play the upper class Roosevelt when it was to his benefit, but he was also willing to challenge social norms when he could get away with it, to change the power of the office of the president. All three of these people are working to redefine what Americans think is possible because of the new economy that's emerging at the turn of the 20th century, because of how power is shifting and changing in politics. And all of them, as much as they change, as much as they challenge social norms, also remain amazingly wedded to certain traditions, like being an upper crust Roosevelt, being an immigrant girl, being a Black fighter who buys into certain ideas that aren't good for Black people in general because it is to his own benefit. So I think in a lot of ways, all three of these figures set up the rest of the 20th century. They really set up the younger Americans of the 1920s to challenge traditional values in ways that probably wouldn't have been possible had they not sort of pushed the boundaries to start with. So again, yes, sir.
I was just going to ask again, what kind of parallels can you draw between Johnson and Muhammad Ali?
Muhammad Ali himself said, "I'm a bad man, but he was crazy." But if you know Muhammad Ali, if you remember his public persona, let's call it an homage. Let's call it an homage to Johnson. That, over the top, loud, the braggadocio. I mean, Muhammad Ali saying, "I'm the greatest," is, very much an imitation of Johnson in the ring with his hand on a guy's head saying, you all love this. I want the best. Bring me something better. That's, that sort of knowing that being a great fighter means not just physically being tough, but I think being smart in ways people don't initially see as smart. I mean, there was a method to Muhammad Ali's madness, right? I mean, he was a great fighter too, scientifically, but also I think he had half of the people he fought beat before they got in the ring. And that's something that Johnson certainly did a number of times. Again, having it in his contract that he gets to go to the ring first, so that when the challenger walks up, here he is standing there waiting for you. I mean, this is intimidating. And he would often call, Johnson would often call the fights. He'd say, "We're going to go 6 rounds today." Or he would make a show of getting in the ring and asking the crowd, like, "How long do you want this to go today?" And then hitting it, being able to deliver. Yes, sir.
How was later years financially and living in the South?
Mm-hmm.
How was he accepted or not accepted or scorned or whatever during his later years in the South?
My understanding is that he was financially fine, that he had enough money that he could live a relatively comfortable life, although it was a pretty quiet life. The last 10 or 15 years, he was sort of a member of the black community in Raleigh. It helped that he was in Raleigh. Raleigh had a long pre-Civil War established black middle class with a number of universities and benevolent societies. So Raleigh in the 40s, and to some extent today, still has neighborhoods where it's a miniature version of Harlem in New York City, where you could be black and be outwardly, be outspoken and be relatively safe. So he was accepted in the black community in Raleigh and was, relatively safe from what I understand. And, he was the kind of person that if a big fight was coming up, the press would the Raleigh News Observer would get in touch. Hey, we want your thoughts on this upcoming fight. What do you think? And he was very happy to play that role. So you might call him like small town, kind of small celebrity type figure late in life.
Did he ever have children that he acknowledged?
That he acknowledged is the good question. I think so, but I will send a better answer along to you through Bob.
3 wives.
Yes, at another engagement.
No alimony.
There's no telling. So,
I'm interested in the parallel between Jack Johnson and Miles Davis.
the jazz musician.
Yeah, well, Miles Davis made a recording in the 1970s called Tribute to Jack Johnson.
I didn't know that.
It's one of his hybrid things
Right.
on for jazz.
Mm-hmm.
But when Miles Davis was coming up in 1959, he was beaten savagely by the New York police.
Yeah.
Totally unprovoked.
Yeah.
And it might have had something to do with the fact that he was driving his bright yellow Ferrari. He was beaten up outside of Birdland, which was,
Yeah.
the jazz capital.
Right. Right.
There were similar characters in terms of their approach to life.
Yeah. I'd be willing to bet that you could go through music, acting, sports, and find people who are along this mold that he established. He's a model for a lot of different people. I think, Johnson went through a bit of a renaissance in the 60s and 70s because of the rise of the Black is Beautiful movement and a rise in Black power. That's the decade, the late 60s, when you start to see the first African American history and African American studies programs being established in American universities. And those scholars went looking for essentially folk heroes who represented this sense of braggadocio and pride that young Black Americans of the late 60s were looking for. So that Miles would make a song with him in the title isn't that surprising to me. It fits that mold, that desire for people in the past who demonstrated, we've always been proud. That's not a new thing. We've always been loud about who we are. We've always stood up to authority. That's, I think, consistent with what a lot of musicians, artists, and writers were doing in the late 60s and early 70s. Anything else? I'm happy to always talk casually afterwards as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. For 3 sessions, I have been absolutely intrigued. When I think about it, born in the 30s or the 40s, this is our heritage. And unfortunately, for me, a piece of the heritage I didn't know well at all. But aren't you glad you're here? And we thank you for it. Go in peace.
Thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
Yes, I learned